What?
Hi, Taiji friends. We have another issue today we need to discuss, and that's about the size of the movements. Big movements for beginners, smaller movements, more refined movements for intermediate and advanced practitioners. And the question is, how small can movements be? Um, can they really become invisible? And does it make sense? And one of my teachers once told me to to control questions for every movement. Number one, is it comfortable? Does it feel good? Number two, does it make sense? And does it make sense means is the martial application possible? Is it correct? This can mean a number of requirements, like is the physical structure, the body structure strong enough, for example, to hold the incoming weight, power, strength of an opponent without breaking? Is the structure strong and correct enough to ward off in a rotational movement, for example, his attack, lead him into emptiness? Is the physical structure and the movement good for me to keep grounded, to keep my balance? And is the movement, are the angles and the movement details correct so I really could grab or throw or ward off my opponent? And this is a question we must always keep in mind when we're doing our forms. Yeah, comparing Tai Chi with writing is also when we start writing, we start with big letters on a big piece of paper, and then slowly the letters become smaller and become more fluently. But there we don't have an opponent. We only need to hit the paper, that's all. In Tai Chi, even though in shadow boxing and doing our forms we don't have an opponent with us, we still should do the movements like fighting with an opponent. And here we're coming to the background of these movements, which was not a health background, even though healthcare was definitely a nice side effect. But we need to know that Tai Chi was developed as martial art. And for healthcare, there were already plenty of Qigong systems, and they did not need to invent another one. So they really invented Tai Chi as martial art, for self-defense, for attack and defense. And the forms had several meanings. First of all, form is a nice physical exercise. First of all, to practice the martial techniques, maintaining structure and angles and everything we need to make them correct. So martial techniques finally can be performed automatically, instinctively, because we repeated them so often. Second, it's a good exercise to transform our structure, our rotations, our physical coordination into movement. What do I mean with that? Tai Chi is round, which means actually, originally, all movements are or were spirals. It's a modern trend that a lot of moves are now being performed horizontally or vertically without a curve, without a rotation. But actually all movements were rotations, because that's the movement principle which we need for warding off an opponent's power, for leading him into emptiness, and as well, of course, to return his power if needed. Or also our way of transferring power from our fist to the opponent doesn't start in the shoulder, but actually it starts in the foot, and it spirals through the body and through the fist into the opponent. So all movements are rotations, and the rotations of the different body sections. We have upper, which means both arms and shoulders. We have middle, that's our torso, and we have lower, which are the legs. These rotations always work in coordination, like in former times the little wheels of a clock that were bigger wheels, smaller wheels, but they were all working together. And here we also have the principle when one part stops, everything stops, and when one part moves, everything moves. That's like in one of these old clocks and these wheel systems. As soon as one part stops, the other parts also need to stop physically, because otherwise we're breaking our structure, number one. And number two, the spiral movement is carrying our inside movement of the qi or jin. And when the spiral movement of the body stops or interrupts the flow of qi, of internal energy, then the internal part finally stops as well. Even though in the beginning our physical movement initiates the movement of qi, the flow of qi or jin, internal energy, and later on our mind creates the flow of internal energy and the body is following. But when the body is not following the flow of internal energy, the martial movements of the forms cannot be performed properly anymore. This was a long story now. So to make it short, internally and externally, everything must be coordinated, as well the rotations of the different body sections, and only when everything is working together, then we really get a correct and useful movement, which can be used for martial arts. And when we're now regarding the requirements of martial arts, then we learned about distances. We know we have different distances with our opponent, like a shoulder strike is the closest, elbow a little bit further, fist is already a little bit more. Then we have several kicks that only can be performed when there is a certain distance. There is certain techniques for certain distances. They simply don't work when we are closer or further away. And so we must also know the movements in our form, that they need a certain frame of movement, otherwise they don't make sense anymore. So, for example, for Pongjin, the ward-off skill, or my expansion skill with which I secure the space around myself, needs enough expansion, because when my arm is not expanded enough, like this, I can keep an opponent on distance, so he cannot hit me. When my structure is a little bit collapsed, or my movement is getting too small, it still might be a nice circle and also coordinated, but then I allow the opponent to come into my space. And even though if I might hold his arm here with my both hands, wrist and elbow with the other hand, the distance is too small. He just takes his other arm and reaches my face, because I'm not, my movement was too small. It doesn't make martial sense anymore. It's not securing my space anymore. And that's not only for the distance to ward off or not to let an opponent enter my space. It's also for spirals and circles. When my hand distance is not big enough, I would not be able to grab the opponent at his elbow and wrist where I'm supposed to, or at his almost at his shoulder, upper arm and wrist, but somewhere else, and that's not useful then in fighting anymore, as a fighting technique anymore. If the circle is too small, we hardly see it. I might not be able to go around his wrist anymore, but only around a finger. But if I need to cover his wrist, his hand or his arm, then the movement needs a certain size. If I want to make, for example, a shoulder throw or something, my arm movement, my hip movement must be big enough really to get under his balance point and throw him. Or if I want to just ward him off and pull him, bringing my center out of the way and pulling him with Lü or Tsai around me, then my hip must be flexible enough to shift my weight. Because if I don't shift my weight, if I don't move my hip, then I might be twisting and turning him to the side, but he might still hit me. It's much easier for him then to counter with the chi, and give me a shoulder strike or something, than when my hip is flexible enough and I shift my weight a little bit. Now, everything maintaining structure, but this is very important. So when a movement becomes small, it's okay, but it's important that it's not too small for martial use. The second aspect is also the training aspect, because the movements in the form were already meant, were also meant for physical training, training the physical aspects of the body, like endurance, like physical strength, like speed, like just muscle strength when going up and down and everything, and also coordinative skills, and hey, and these animals have the best skills, by the way. And when we don't practice enough movement, then our tendons, our muscles are not flexible enough. Our joints don't produce enough joint fluid, and the training effect of the form decreases. So it's very important to make sure when we're doing our forms that we're not just minimalizing our movements and doing as much as possible internally, but we should never forget that the form is also wonderful physical training, and and this needs a certain frame, this needs a certain expansion, a certain size to be effective for the body, like blood flow, blood circulation, stimulating the lymphatic system, making tendons and muscles really flexible and elastic. Also maintaining a good punction in arms and legs, making good bows, opening the body, and training the muscles of our torso, also stimulating the digestive system, the waves and movements of the spine and of the chest, folding the chest, for example, or waving the spine. All these movements, figure 8 in the hip, are very important to keep the body trained and flexible, especially also for the knees that should move, and they should also make little circles. But of course this must be trained so the muscles and tendons around the knees are strong, and then the knee joint produces enough joint fluid, and then we can really move the knees. And when we take care that the weight is not too much on the forefoot, we can make amazing circles with the knees without getting knee problems. On the opposite, we can even heal joint issues that we might have had before. I experienced that myself, so I know it works, and these are amazing benefits, but they all require proper exercise. So I recommend, of course, try to refine your movements and try to make your movements smaller, but always keep an eye on the martial sense, the martial use. Don't become too small, and once in a while consciously do bigger movements, because it might be very good for your body, for stimulating it, for stimulating also the chi flow and the meridians and everything. So just mix it, big movements, small movements, a very slow form, very internal form, and sometimes also a little bit more young and do the form a little bit quicker. Of course, build it up slowly. In the beginning, you do slow movements, you do big movements, and once they are working and they start to flow, then make the next step, and like this you can develop a wonderful form. Now, please don't make the mistake that you see a grandmaster who is hardly moving anymore and try to copy it, because he needed 30, 40, 50, 60 years to get to a point that his internal power is still maintained and is still working while he is physically doing almost nothing. But believe me, it won't work for a beginner. The only thing that happens is nothing inside, and also the required development will not take place. So you need to go the same way your grandmaster went. You need to start with the big movements and slowly work down to the slower movements. And then you also don't know which aspects the grandmaster is training. Maybe he doesn't care so much on martial move anymore because he got kind of internal skill. But never forget, for a normal practitioner, for understanding your martial art, you need to understand the martial applications that are hidden in the form, and your movements must be accordingly. So don't make them too small, and keep on practicing. Success, and see you next time. Bye bye.